हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू सिविल फ्रंट। दोस्तों, सिविल फ्रंट में आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। दोस्तों, डेली मेंस आंसर राइटिंग प्रोग्राम थ्रू प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चन का आज हमारा डे 6 है और आज डे 6 को हम इंडियन मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री से रिलेटेड कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चंस का डिस्कशन करेंगे। सो द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज, in what ways did the naval mutiny prove to be the last nail in the coffin of the British colonial aspirations in India? The British colonial aspirations in India. Correct. Now the topic of the question is naval mutiny. Naval mutiny is the main topic, and that's why we will be introducing with what was Indian naval mutiny, or basically naval mutiny. Correct. So the Royal Indian Navy, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny of February 1946, when it happened is February 1946. It was a significant event that underscored the growing discontent within the British Indian Armed Forces. The British Indian Armed Forces, within the British Indian Armed Forces, there was a discontent growing, and that was actually reflected in the Royal Indian Navy mutiny. Correct. Now, occurring against, now what were the context during the Indian mutiny, naval mutiny? Was there was a intensified national movement. The national movement, overall national movement was actually intensified. A part of that, the British grip on India after the World War II was also weakening. The British hold over the India after the World War II was also weakening, and that's why in context of this particular situation, the mutiny is considered a very decisive factor that actually hastened the India's independence. Okay, so let's try to first understand what was the background of the naval mutiny. The immediate cause for the mutiny was, mutiny began on 18th of February 1946. Where it actually began? It began at the naval barracks HMIS Talwar, very important, HMIS Talwar in Bombay. Correct. Now the sailors, they protested against, what were their grievances? The grievances were poor living conditions, racial discrimination, and inadequate pay. Correct. So this particular mutiny quickly escalated into a broader anti-colonial revolt. It was mere a mutiny, but then quickly it escalated into broader anti-colonial revolt, as they raised the demands for independence and released the political prisoner. Their demand was an independence. At the same time, they were asking for the release of the political prisoners. So this very important things to understand. It began on 18th of February 1946, began in HMIS Talwar, Mumbai, in Bombay, correct, at that time Bombay, and the reasons were poor living conditions, racial discrimination, inadequate pay, and what were the demand was independence and release of the political prisoners. So if we see the context during the mutiny was, in 1942 there was a Quit India movement which actually showcased the mass resistance against the British government. Subhash Chandra Bose Indian National Army trials, Subhash Chandra Bose INA trials in 1945, that actually evoked the widespread nationalist sentiments. So already there was a mass resistance to the British government because of the Quit India movement that was generated actually, and also because of the Indian National Army's trials in 1945 that actually also evoked the widespread nationalist sentiments were generated. And a part of that, there were economic hardships and Bengal famine in 1943, which also exacerbated the public discontent. So there were multiple factors because of which the public sentiments were against the British government. First was due to Quit India movement, then due to INA trials, and then because of the Bengal famine and economic hardships. So overall, there was an atmosphere of a public discontent against the British government, and in that moment this mutiny occurred. So that actually again exacerbated the discontent among the Indians for against the British. Correct. Now, the important thing is, what was the impact of the naval mutiny on the British colonial aspirations? What was the impact? Okay. The first is the breakdown of military discipline. Very important. See, this mutiny exposed the British failure to maintain the loyalty among the Indian armed forces. Historically, the military used to be the backbone of the colonial control. Because of the military only, the British was able to control the colony, and historically it has been loyal. But then eventually British failed to maintain the same loyalty, and this is the truth. This truth got exposed because of this mutiny. The truth that British failed to maintain the loyalty of the Indian armed forces, that got exposed. Second is the nationalist sentiments among the soldiers. The mutiny reflected how the nationalist ideas had permeated the armed forces, traditionally insulated from the political movements. See, what used to happen traditionally, the armed forces were insulated from the political movements. So the military personnels were isolated from the political events, so that they should not get influenced, and they should remain loyal to the British. But then the nationalist ideas by now they got permeated among the armed forces also, so that were reflected in the mutiny. How can we say that? We can say that the sailors hoisted the Congress, Muslim League and Communist Party flags on the ships, which symbolize the unified anti-colonial sentiment. There were anti-colonial sentiment, and that too unified, because there were multiple flags, not just of Congress but of Muslim League, but of Communist Party. Correct. And that's why we can see that first the nationalist sentiments were permeated, and also there were anti-colonial sentiment which were in the unified format. Next point is mass public support. Mutiny garnered widespread civilian support. This is also very significant. Correct. This mutiny got the support of civilians. For example, many civilians they did strikes, they did protest, erupting across the Bombay, Karachi and Calcutta, among many different places. So workers, students and political activists, they rallied behind the mutiny, and that's why that turned naval mutiny into a larger anti-British uprising. So naval mutiny did not remain limited to a mutiny, but it turned out to be a large-scale anti-British uprising. Why? Because there was a widespread support from the civilians, as well as there were many sections of the society like workers, students and political activists also involved into this particular activity. So then the next point is erosion of the British authority. Now the problem was the response to this mutiny by the British was a very harsh, and that's why this violent response, this violent suppression even alienated Indians further from the Britishers, and it exposed the British reliance on the force. Correct, on the force, because we understood that British rely on the force even so this violent suppression alienated Indians further and exposed the British reliance on the force to maintain the control. The next point is mutiny also signaled to British that even the military, their most dependable institution, this is very important, military was one of the most dependable institution which used to provide the loyalty, which used to had a loyalty towards British, and Britishers actually gained the control over the territory of the India only and only because of the military. But now this the very most dependable institution can also no longer be relied, मतलब अभी इस पर भी डिपेंड नहीं रहा जा सकता है. That British got to understand, the British got to know, correct, the British got to know. So this mutiny actually signaled the fact that the very institution you are most dependable upon can no longer be relied upon. That British understood. Mutiny also intensified the calls for the independence. Their demand was independence. Actually, independence was actually the demand. Essentially, that was a demand of the overall national movement. But this mutiny intensified this demand further. They intensified this demand further. Along with that, they also demanded the prisoners, the political leaders, and British to accelerate the transfer of power. They also pushed the political leaders and British to accelerate the transfer of power, this entire process. So, in that context, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, recognized the growing untenability of the British control that they got now. They understood that it's now become very difficult to control, because when the very dependable institutions like military is not actually able to be controlled, and you are not able to garner the loyalty of the military itself, then how you are going to maintain your rule in India? So they got to understand that it's now become very untenable for them to control the India, and that's why by 1947 India gained independence, with naval mutiny serving as a key factor in demonstrating the urgency of the decolonization. They understood that we have to now decolonize, we have to go back to British, we have to go back to England. Correct. Now, if we see what were the significance of the naval mutiny in the Indian history, that it has actually accelerated the decolonization process. It actually was a symbol of the unity. It also was a symbol of unity, and it has also created a legacy of resistance. Mutiny inspired future anti-colonial and military resistance movements across Asia and Africa. It also emphasized the role of armed forces in shaping the political change, because earlier most of the movements, for example, let's say civil disobedience movement, let's say non-cooperation movement, or let's say any other movement which were the part of the India struggle for independence, were mainly composed of the civilians, and military for a very large amount of time and for rest of the time remained loyal. But when military also had its grievances and they broke that loyalty, the political change accelerated and India got independent. Moving to the next question, we have to examine the linkages between 19th century Indian Renaissance and emergence of the national identity. How the Indian Renaissance was related to the emergence of national identity. Now, what were the factors under the Indian Renaissance? Let's say socio-religious awakening, socio-religious reform movements, that is a part of, then also Indian heritage, the re-emergence of the Indian heritage and the proud on it. Then also the role of media which got newly introduced, and then education, very important factor in the Renaissance. So all these actually created the sense of unity among the Indians, and it also created a sense of identity in the Indians. So how that happened, that is actually the question about. We have to examine all the factors and linkages. First important thing is cultural revival and assertion of the identity. Indian Renaissance, Indians actually rediscovered their rich heritage, which actually countered the colonial narratives. There was a colonial narratives that demeaned Indian civilization as a backward. The colonial scholars actually demeaned Indian civilization as a backward civilization. But because of this Renaissance, we discovered our rich cultural heritage, so we got the counter argument to this particular colonial narratives which actually demean Indian civilization as a backward. For example, reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, he worked to revive the pride in the ancient Indian texts like Vedas and Upanishads. So the reassertion of the cultural identity, this reassertion of our cultural identity actually fostered the collective consciousness among the Indians, inspiring the movements like Swadeshi movement, which emphasized upon the self-reliance and pride in the indigenous products. Now, if we see the linkages between Indian Renaissance and the national identity, the first important point is due to Indian Renaissance, Indians discovered the rich heritage of India. Correct. There was a colonial narrative which demeaned the Indian civilization as a backward civilization. But due to this rediscovery of India's rich heritage, they got the counter argument because they got the pride now. They got the pride now, and that's why they could counter argue the colonial narrative which actually demeaned the Indian civilization as a backward civilization. Then socio-religious reform movements, the reform movements like Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Prarthana Samaj, they sought to reform Indian society by addressing the issues like caste discrimination, sati, child marriage and untouchability. So by addressing such issues, they wanted to reform the Indian society, and these movements actually emphasized the equality and human dignity, the equality and human dignity. Then if we see the critique of colonialism and modern education, now the introduction of Western education under the colonial rule, the Western education was introduced under the colonial rule that actually exposed Indians to the liberal ideas like democracy, equality and individual rights. Now Indians got exposed to these liberal ideas like democracy, equality and individual rights. And how this happened? This happened because of the Western education. Indians got exposed to all these novel ideas because of the Western education. So that's why the thinkers like Dadabhai Nauroji, Mahadev Govind Rande, they used these ideas, these very liberal ideas, they used to critique the British policies and economic exploitation. For example, Dadabhai Nauroji's drain of wealth theory articulated a common economic grievances that united Indians against the colonial rule. Indians got united against the colonial rule due to this drain of wealth theory, because this drain of wealth theory actually articulated the common grievance of all the Indians, because all the Indians were economically exploited. So that this drain of wealth theory actually reflected that how the Indians were exploited, every nook and corner, like every Indian irrespective of the space and time, they got exploited. So how this exploitation was going on, this was exposed to the drain of wealth theory, and this drain of wealth theory was actually exposed due to the liberal ideals. They got exposed due to the Western education. If we see the role of literature and print media, Indian Renaissance fostered a literary and intellectual awakening with newspapers and journals and books promoting the nationalist ideals. Whatever the newspapers of that time, whatever the journals got published and books got written and published, these all the intellectual and literary sources were actually promoting the nationalist ideas. Correct. Like publications like Kesari by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bengali by Surendranath Banerjee, they emphasized on the India's rich cultural and historical unity, that India culturally was always united, even historically was always united. So such kind of nationalist unity sentiments, they were promoted through the literary sources. For example, even the literary figures like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee wrote a nationalist works like Anandamat, which introduced the hymn Vande Mataram, which later adopted as a nationalist anthem, If we see the modernization of the religious practices, the socio-religious reform movements and the reformers, they blended traditional values with the modern ideas to create a progressive national identity. This is very important. They also created a progressive national identity by blending traditional values and modern ideas. For instance, Swami Vivekananda's speeches at the 1893 Chicago Parliament of the religions that showcased India's spiritual richness, inspiring both Indians and the global audience. So he emphasized on the self-confidence and unity laid the moral foundation for the nationalist movement. The emphasis on self-confidence, what he emphasized upon the self-confidence and the unity, these two important aspects actually helped laid the foundation, the moral foundation for the nationalist movement. Role of science and rationalism. The Indian Renaissance also emphasized on the scientific temper and rationalism rather than orthodoxy mindset. They also emphasized upon the rationalism. For example, Jagdish Chandra Bose and Praful Chandra Ray, they demonstrated India's potential in the science. Like India is also not a backward civilization, but India also holds a lot of potential in the fields like science. So that's why the colonial stereotypes, there was a colonial stereotypes about the intellectual inferiority of India. They actually imagine India as intellectually inferior, but it was not the case. By showing the research and the potential of the science through the J.C. Bose and P.C. Ray, we demonstrated that India too has a potential, and we actually encourage the scientific temper and rationalism in India. If we see, there was an emergence of regional and linguistic nationalism also. Renaissance saw the revival of regional languages and literature. Fostering the regional identities that later contributed to the pan-Indian nationalist movement. For instance, Rabindranath Tagore's writings in Bengali emphasized the cultural pride while addressing the universality of the Indian nationalism. Means it also emphasized on the Indian nationalism, which was a universal idea for Indians, but apart of that, some cultural pride upon the regional cultures, that was also emphasized. Also, the period saw the rise of educational institutions. The educational institutions were also on rise, like Hindu College in Kolkata, which actually became the centers for the nationalist thought. The nationalist thoughts, the nationalist ideas, these were also mainly erupted among the educational institutions. So reformist organizations like Indian National Association and Indian National Congress, these are also very important. The Indian National Congress and some other organizations like Indian National Associations, they also play a very important role in intellectual and cultural currents of the Renaissance to articulate the demand for the self-rule. Now, if we see what was the impact of the Indian Renaissance on the national identity, so first it created a cultural confidence. Then it also provided a foundation for the political nationalism. It also integrated the modernity with the tradition. And mainly it has created a pan-Indian unity by addressing the issues like caste, communalism and gender inequality. So we can conclude by saying that by integrating the modernity with tradition, the Renaissance not only enriched the India's cultural legacy, but also laid a groundwork for a collective vision of an independent and progressive nation. A collective vision. We actually cultivated a collective vision through this Renaissance. And what was the collective vision? That was of an independent and progressive nation. Moving to the next question, we have to trace the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements with special reference. We have to actually talk about how they rise and how they grow about the socio-religious reform movements, but special reference to be given to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. Fine. In the introduction, we will tell the context of the socio-religious reform movements in the 19th century. Then, how the socio-religious reform movements they actually rise. First and foremost factor was impact of the colonial rule and Western education. The introduction of the English education got introduced, and the Indians got exposure to the Enlightenment ideas under the British colonial rule. So that actually, this exposure to the Enlightenment ideas provided the intellectual tools to to critique the traditional practices. The traditional practices means actually it created a rationalism in the minds of the Indians, in the minds of the Indians who got that education, English education. So they got enlightened and they actually started criticizing the traditional practices which were not good. For example, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Henry Vivian Deroggio, they emerged from this milieu. Also, the another factor was decline of the Mughal power and rise of modernism. The weakening of Mughal empire and growing influence of the British power. British power was also growing. Their influence was also growing. So that actually created a socio-political vacuum. There was a creation of a socio-political vacuum that encouraged introspection and reform. Because there was a socio-political vacuum, so Indians also got the time to introspect and reform our own Indian society. Then there was also influence of Christian missionaries. The missionary activities brought attention to the social evils like sati and untouchability, compelling Indian thinkers to reform these practices and defend their culture on the rational grounds. Now, the important thing is you want to defend your culture, but you cannot defend your culture on irrational grounds. You cannot defend anything like sati. So you will have to, you were compelled to bring your attention, and you were compelled to remove such practices, such evil practices like sati and untouchability. So missionary activities also brought attention of the Indians into such problems and issues. If we see, the economic and social changes was also one of the important factor. The colonial economic policies actually disrupted the traditional socio-economic structure. What was the traditional socio-economic structure that got disrupted due to the economic policies of the British government that led to the urbanization? This resulted to the urbanization, and that actually led to the growth, because there was a urbanization. So whenever there is a urbanization, there is a re-emergence, there is a emergence of the new middle class, and this new middle class became the backbone of these reform movements, because new middle class was intelligentsia and also they were educated. So this very new middle class acted as a backbone of these socio-religious reform movements, because they were educated, they were enlightened. So they started challenging and questioning the irrational traditional practices, and they also wanted to reform the Hinduism, or basically Indian society. Now if we see the special reference to the Brahmo Samaj, how it rise and growth. So what was the foundational philosophy of Brahmo Samaj? See, Brahmo Samaj was founded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in 1828 as a reformist movement. This was important. This was not an orthodoxy movement. This was a reformist movement. They wanted to reform, and they wanted to reform Hinduism from within. So what they sought is, they sought to purify religion. They sought to purify religion by eliminating the idol worship. They wanted to eliminate idol worship. They wanted to eliminate superstition. They wanted to eliminate rituals, and they wanted to emphasize on the monotheism, a common God, a single God, correct? And use of reason, means they also wanted the Indians to be rational, and they wanted to focus upon the rationalism. Now, the social reforms, Brahmo Samaj campaigned against the practices like sati, child marriage, and polygamy. Roy's efforts were instrumental in abolition of sati in 1829. The sati was abolished, and the credit must go to Brahmo Samaj and Raja Ram Mohan Roy. The contributions of the Devendranath Tagore, if we see, under the Devendranath Tagore, now the leadership got shifted to Devendranath Tagore. So Devendranath Tagore, the movement focused upon the spiritual and philosophical aspect. Mainly this Brahmo Samaj movement focused upon the spiritual and philosophical aspect under the leadership of Devendranath Tagore. So he actually formalized the movement by drafting Brahmo Covenant and opposed caste discrimination. He opposed caste discrimination. Under the Keshav Chandra Sen, now again the leader Keshav Chandra Sen, he introduced reforms addressing the caste equality and women's emancipation. They focused upon caste equality and women's emancipation, including intercaste marriages. So his leadership saw that Brahmo Samaj extended its influence beyond even the Bengal, that not remained limited to Bengal, but its influence went beyond the Bengal. If we talk about the Young Bengal movement, rise and growth, so the foundation and leadership, Young Bengal movement was actually spearheaded by Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers. He was a professor at the Hindu College. Kolkata, in 1820s and 1830s. So actually Desrosiers was influenced by the Western liberal thought. And he inspired his students to question the orthodox beliefs. You must question the orthodox belief and adopt rationalism and question the orthodox beliefs that he actually taught to the students. So the movement advocated for freedom of thought. What were they advocated for? They advocated for freedom of thought, they advocated for gender equality, and they advocated for secularism. Correct? And they rejected idolatry. They were opposed of idolatry. They were opposed of caste discrimination, and they also opposed the blind adherence to the traditions, urging the reforms in education, religion, and society. Also, they promoted the Western ideals. For example, the members of the Young Bengal group, they actively promoted English education, critical thinking, and social reform. They promoted social reform, critical thinking, and English education. Even they published journals and participated in the debates, spreading the progressive ideas. Through the debates and through the basically journals they published, they actually promoted the progressive ideas. But if we see, the decline of this particular movement was due to, first of all, it faced criticism for its overemphasis on the Western ideals, because they emphasized more, they were driven by the Western liberal thought. So by overemphasizing on the Western liberals, they detach from the grassroots issues. That was actually the perception created among the people, that they are not able to addressing the grassroots issues. They also lack the organizational structure. So eventually the movement got declined after actually untimely death of Desrosiers in 1831, but that actually left the lasting intellectual impact. If we compare both the movements, so Brahmo Samaj mainly focused upon reforming Hinduism, whereas Young Bengal movement advocated for complete rejection of the orthodoxy traditions. Brahmo Samaj focused and it worked action, here important is action. It worked actively on the social reforms like widow remarriage, education, and abolition of sati, whereas Young Bengal movement mainly concentrated on the intellectual awakening. So basically words and action. So it actually mainly concentrated on intellectual awakening, fostering critical thinking among the youth. If we see the scope of influence, the Brahmo Samaj expanded its reach across India and influenced the latter reform movements also, whereas the Young Bengal movement had a limited reach, and that was limited to urban intellectuals in the Bengal with less mass appeal. It had hardly any mass appeal. If we see the impact of the socio-religious reform movements, then it got modernized the Indian society got modernized. That also helped create intellectual awakening, and also it acted as a catalyst for the women's empowerment. This is very, very important point. The socio-religious reform movements actually acted as a catalyst for the women's empowerment, and most important thing is their role in the nationalism. The emphasis on the equality, justice, and rationality resonated with emerging nationalist ideologies, inspiring leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and Tagore. So this is how then we can conclude that together all these national movement, be it the Desrosiers movement, Young Bengal movement, or be it a Brahmo Samaj, they modernized the Indian society, laid the intellectual groundwork for India's freedom struggle, and that's why these movements reflect the interplay of the tradition and modernity in shaping India's socio-political landscape. I hope you understood all these three previous year questions. So we will discuss the next topic in the next session. Thank you very much for the time being.